Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for tuning into the podcast. In today's episode, we are going to defend one of the most important doctrines of Christianity, and we're going to defend it from a very specific attack that came from an atheist skeptic on the resurrection of Jesus. Stay tuned. All right, well, let's get started. I want to welcome you all here. If this is your first time listening to the podcast, my name's Chad, and this podcast is all about helping you to know, love, and defend the Word. And today, we need to address in further detail one of the most important doctrines and truth claims of Christianity. In fact, I would say that this is probably the most. I don't know if it gets any more important than the doctrine that we're going to deal with today. And that doctrine is the resurrection of Jesus. Christians across the globe, Orthodox, Bible-believing Christians, even Orthodox, like Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Catholics, what unifies all of us is the belief that Jesus of Nazareth bodily rose from the dead 3 days after being crucified on the cross. And this really is the centerpiece of all of Christianity. If this part of Christianity gets disproven, then all of Christianity falls with it. Like if this drops, the whole thing drops. If this part gets disproven, all of Christianity gets disproven. And I'll tell you why. Paul actually in 1 Corinthians 15 lays out the very reasons why Christianity is completely bogus if Christ didn't rise from the dead. He'll say in 1 Corinthians 15 that if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, we're still in our sins. Our guilt and our moral failures have not been fixed. We are still stuck in our sin, which means we then have to figure out some other method, some other means by which we can redeem ourselves. And historically, for thousands and thousands of years, humans have not been able to do that. So if Christ didn't rise, we're up a creek. We are still in our sin. We have not been cleansed from our failure. He also then goes on to say, if Christ didn't rise from the dead, then we're following a lie. We're not following the truth. We've been duped. We have been fooled by one of the most scandalous figures then of all of history. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, he is single-handedly the greatest liar and the greatest deceiver that has ever lived. We are just following another messianic figure and a long line of messianic figures from other religions, from other cults, from other different religions. They all made claims about being able to save, but they ultimately couldn't back them up. And Jesus is just like that. And in fact, it goes even further because Jesus predicted he would rise from the dead. And if it didn't happen, there is even more proof that he's a liar. And in fact, it goes even further. The Old Testament was predicting that Jesus would come to the earth. He would die on a cross for our sins and then be resurrected. And so if none of this happened, Jesus is a liar. The Old Testament is a liar. We've been duped. We are not following the truth. We are following a lie. And then to add insult to injury, Paul goes on even to say further, if all of this stuff is fake, then Christians are to be pitied more than anybody else because we are subjecting ourselves to moral standards and moral regulations that the rest of the world isn't. Right? So we're denying ourselves of carnal, sinful pleasures because we think that isn't a way to honor and love Christ. But if Christ isn't resurrected from the dead, and if he's not really God, well, then who cares? We're denying ourselves unnecessarily. We are robbing ourselves of the fun and the pleasures and the delights that this world has to offer. We're living these like frigid, restricted lives for no reason at all. And so Paul goes, man, if Christ didn't rise from the dead, all of this stuff is absolutely ridiculous. But he then goes on to say, no, Christ did rise from the dead. And all of these things are not true about us. We are not to be pitied most of all. In fact, we have the greatest hope that mankind has ever heard. So the reason why I want to try to go after this today And I want to play for you a clip in just a little bit of a particular atheist who really goes for the jugular of this doctrine that Christ really resurrected from the dead. The reason why I want to go after this is not just to like dunk on the atheists. That's not my intention. We do fight deceptions, we do fight lies, and we fight that with the truth. But it's not my heart to want to like just bash on the atheists. They have genuine questions, and I want to give them the benefit of the doubt as image bearers. But to go further, I want to try to equip you, the listener, with some real reasons to believe what we believe. There is so much doubt and skepticism in our world. It seems like doubt and skepticism, uncertainty, just it hits us from all kinds of different angles. And what has helped me a lot, not just like an intellectual exercise, but what's helped my soul really rest and trust and find peace in Christ is knowing these things on an intellectual level. Knowing some of these arguments intellectually has helped me spiritually. And that's what I'm trying to do today. That's my heart, is not just like let's intellectually exercise here, but let's fill our minds in the hopes that it then fortifies our hearts, helps us trust and love and enjoy and rest more in Christ, right? That's what I'm trying to do today. So when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus, here's how the early church argued, and here's really how we have been continuing this tradition for the last 2,000 plus years. The disciples, the 12 guys that followed Christ, along with some of his inner circle beyond the 12, they all argued that they were eyewitnesses to his earthly ministry, to his death, and to his resurrection from the dead. When Paul goes out to all of the different Greek world, when Peter goes to all of the different Jewish brothers and sisters he had, when all of the rest of the 12, they went out and they were sharing about what Christ had done, their argument was never, believe this story because we're telling you to believe it. Their story was, we saw it, other people can vouch for what we're saying. Don't believe it simply because we're telling you. Believe it because we're telling you. Other people can back up what we're telling you. You can fact check what we're saying. This is the truth. Jesus is the truth. And you don't have to just take our word for it. And so let me give you a little bit of Bible here to back up what I'm saying. In 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 16, Peter says, we didn't follow cleverly invented stories when we testified to you about Christ. We were eyewitnesses to his majesty. We were eyewitnesses to his glory. We saw it firsthand. In 1 John 1:1, John once again says, we were eyewitnesses. We saw this. We beheld it. We touched it. We sat with him. We saw it physically. Luke chapter 1. Luke is a Gentile doctor. He's a man of medicine, a man of science. This man in Luke chapter 1 says, I am creating for you, Theophilus, an orderly account of what happened, of what we saw, of what we were eyewitnesses to. Without a doubt, though, the Mac Daddy verse of them all is 1 Corinthians 15. Because in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul lays out an argument. And he's laying it out to a very skeptical, very sinful, very Greek, very pagan church. The Corinthians were a buck wild church. I don't have time to go into all their stuff, but they were a crazy church. And what he says to the Corinthians is that Jesus died according to the scriptures. And the reason why that's important is he's appealing to prophecy. This death was according to prophecy, what Isaiah 53 predicted, what Psalm 22 predicted. He came just like Isaiah 7, like Isaiah 9 predicted, just like what Micah 5 predicted. He came just like the scriptures predicted, died just like the scriptures said would happen, and he resurrected. Then here's where he goes. He says, I am not the only one that saw him. He showed himself, first of all, to his women followers, showed himself then to the 12. After the 12, he showed himself to me, And then Paul makes one of the craziest statements in the Bible. He showed himself to over 500 people in Jerusalem. He showed himself to all of these people in a major metropolitan city. So Paul then, appealing to this skeptical, pagan, self-indulgent church in Corinth, right, this culture of Greek hedonism in Corinth, his appeal for the reliability of the gospel isn't, believe me because I said so, it's believe me and you can fact check me. You don't have to take my word for it. There's over 500 people in Jerusalem who can vouch for what I'm telling you. Now, this statement has been a weapon in the arsenal for Christians for years and years. However, it's recently coming under more and more attack. And what I want to do is play for you a clip here real quick of a popular YouTube atheist skeptic. A guy just goes by the name of T Jump. He lays out his argument here. And what I want to do is listen to his argument, and then we will pull his argument apart. Check this out.
You see, Jesus appeared to groups of over 500 people at one time.
Sant Sai Baba did miracles in front of 10,000 people at one time. Is that evidence that it's true? Or are they all lying? No, they're not lying. It's because there's this thing called communal reinforcement. It's where you see something off in the distance and you don't understand what it is, and the people around you say it's this. And you're like, oh, I kind of feel like that's true, so I'm going to accept it and say it's true. So hallucinations do actually happen in groups. It's called folie à deux. You can Google it, folie à deux. It's a thing. But more importantly, it's called bereavement delusion. Bereavement delusion happens to like 60% of people. If they have a loved one die, they see them after they're dead, even with them without them actually having risen from the dead. They didn't actually rise from the dead, but you see them or hear them, you can touch them, that kind of stuff. So all the crap that you think is evidence for Jesus resurrecting isn't. It's just common psychological stuff we already know about, which is why Jesus' resurrection is rejected in every academic field, including history, psychology, neurology, everything. It's not taken seriously. So yeah, it's been debunked. Like all the things you've said, none of those are evidence because we can explain them with common things that happen in all religions all over the world. Bereavement delusion, communal reinforcement, not hard. Also, we don't actually have evidence of him appearing in front of 500 people. We have a testimony of one guy writing it down that he appeared in front of 500 people. But again, that can be explained. Same as the miracle of Fatima. They saw something in the sky and said, oh, it's Jesus. But yeah, we don't actually have 500 eyewitnesses. We have one not eyewitness who just wrote down that there were 500 eyewitnesses.
Okay, let's take a little bit of time here to examine what he's arguing about, because he's going after the jugular. He really is going after the cornerstone of Christianity. The resurrection is the linchpin. If the resurrection is disproven, all of Christianity is disproven with it. So this is really important for us to know how to defend, not just so we can dunk on the atheists, but that our hearts might be fortified, that our hearts might be emboldened by the gospel of Christ. Now, he starts off by saying, he takes a clip here of a Christian, and the Christian's laying out this 1 Corinthians 15 argument, over 500 people. He comes back and he says a name. I've listened to this clip, I don't know, 15, 20 times. I can't catch the name. It sounds like Sali Saba. I don't know who he's quoting here, but he says some particular figure did miracles to over 10,000 people. And then what he does is he says, is that somehow more evidence that this miracle was better? That just because he showed it to 10,000 people, that somehow outshines the miracle of Christ? And what he's doing here is making somewhat of an analogical fallacy. And I'll explain it this way. He says that just because this guy showed himself to 10,000 people, does that make his miracle any stronger? Well, he's making the mistake of assuming that the number of people alone who witness the miracle is what gives the miracle strength. But that's not the case. I mean, I'll give you an example. David Copperfield has done illusions in front of millions and millions of people. Like, I remember as a kid watching this dude make like elephants and space shuttles disappear, right? Just because millions of people see something, the amount of people who witness something isn't what necessarily gives the miracle strength. It is the amount who sees it along with the nature of the miracle. right? And here's what you will not find anywhere else in the world. You will not find anywhere else in the world the claim that a man was born of a virgin, died on a cross for sinners, buried in a grave, verifiably buried in a grave, and then 3 days later bodily resurrects from that grave. The grave is verifiably empty, and for roughly 40 days, that resurrected Messiah is showing himself physically to all kinds of other people. There are resurrection stories in all kinds of other religions. None of them have the veracity. None of them have the eyewitness appearance. None of them have the physical, like the physicality of Christ's resurrection. There are resurrection mythologies all over the world, but they're usually unwitnessed. If they are witnessed, it's for a brief, fleeting moment. They do not have the intimate, face-to-face nature of Christ's resurrection, right? And so this is what he's mistaking. He's going, well, people have witnessed miracles and it's been in the order of 10,000s. Okay, well, who cares? It could be 10 million. What really matters is who saw it and what's the nature of the miracle. Because this resurrection claim is single-handedly the craziest miracle of all, that he has defeated death. The greatest religions in the world today cannot compete with this claim. Buddha is still dead. The prophet Muhammad, when he ascended into heaven, that was an unwitnessed event, right? We have all kinds of different mythologies out there, but none of them match up with the personal, corporeal, physical, like you could touch him. He's right here for more than a month afterwards. See, the nature of the miracle is very different, and that's what T. Jump here, that's the name of this guy, that's what he missed in his critique. So it's not the number, it's the number and the nature of the miracle. Now, after this, he goes into something called communal reinforcement. And what he says is we can explain the resurrection away by this phenomena of communal reinforcement. And communal reinforcement is the idea that you see something like off in the distance. It could be a shape, it could be some kind of occurrence. You're not really sure what you're seeing, and there's other people standing there watching it. And because you don't understand it, you're trying to process the information. Then somebody chimes in and says, oh, I think it's this. I think it's X. I think it's Y. I think it's Z. And you start to feed off of that. And then there becomes kind of this communal feedback loop where you're all feeding off of this common idea and you're trying to make sense of what you've seen. And so he is trying to explain the resurrection away through communal reinforcement. The problem with this argument is that the gospel accounts don't record Jesus far off in the distance. They don't record him being far away, shadowy, ambiguous, and you're trying to piece it together. They record him up close and personal. Like Luke chapter 24, verse 39. It's a wild verse in the Gospels. Jesus literally says to his disciples, it's like he knows what they're thinking. He says to the disciples, he goes, come here, you can touch me. I'm not a ghost. He says that phrase, which is wild. It's like he knows that the disciples are sitting there going, we must be losing our minds. And he goes, no, you're not. Look, a ghost doesn't have flesh and bone. Come, touch me. Let's eat. Multiple times we see the resurrected Christ having meals with his followers. Right? This isn't like a flashing, passing glance. In John chapter 20, verse 28, one of my favorite parts here of the Gospel of John, you have Thomas, doubting Thomas. I feel like me and Thomas would get along. Like a lot of skepticism in Thomas. I am wired up that same way. Thomas literally says to his crew, I will not believe Christ has resurrected from the dead until I put my fingers in his wounds. And finally, the opportunity comes. He sees Christ. He puts his fingers in his wounds. I mean, tactile confirmation. He feels the wounds. He feels the flesh and bone of Christ. And then he falls at Jesus' feet and says those famous words, O kuriasmu, O theosmu, my Lord, my God. I mean, all through the resurrection accounts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there's this corporeal, physical, tangible, he's not far off. It's not off in the distance. It's not some shadowy thing you're trying to solve with a bunch of buddies. Like, they all are seeing it. And Jesus is actually having to dispel what he knows they're going to think. Hey, I'm not a ghost. I'm not a ghost. Come here. Come touch me. See that I am flesh and bone. So this communal reinforcement idea just doesn't fit what the gospel records. It doesn't fit how these appearances, these post-mortem appearances, happened. Then, after he does this communal reinforcement idea, he goes into a spin-off of the hallucination theory. The hallucination theory is a way that naturalists have tried to explain the resurrection for years. And he goes kind of a different angle that I haven't heard yet. He calls it the bereavement delusion. This is a psychological phenomenon. Maybe you've experienced it yourself. A loved one passes away, and what we oftentimes will call bereavement delusions is you'll maybe be shopping, or you'll maybe be at your house, and you see like a passing glance of your departed loved one. Or like you're going down an aisle at a store, and it looks like your loved one just turns the corner and then they're out of sight. You missed them. Sometimes people will have this overwhelming sense that their loved one is nearby, or they'll feel like a brush across their shoulder. And what T-Jump tries to do here is he tries to equate these bereavement delusions with what the early disciples, these 12 men, were seeing. 11, because Judas is dead at this point, but it soon becomes 12. He's trying to equate that with this. And here's the problem. Bereavement delusions do not fit, once again, what's recorded in the Bible. If you look at the psychological literature on bereavement delusions, they're very much like what I just explained. They're short, quick, fleeting little experiences. It's catching the tail end of your loved one. It's a brush of the hair. It's maybe you smell something that smells like them. There are no recorded bereavement delusions that have somebody sitting down with you for hours on end, sharing a meal with you. In some regards, Jesus is cooking the meal for the disciples, where you're physically touching them, not just like a glancing little flick, but like you can hold his hand, hug him. You can see the color in his eyes. These bereavement delusions do not fit at all what is recorded in the Gospels. And then you have to start thinking to yourself, what's really happening here if this is a delusion, if this is a hallucination? What you have to then argue is that you have multiple people, at least the disciples, right? You have to admit then that they are all simultaneously having the exact same auditory delusion, the exact same somatic delusion, the exact same tactile delusion, the exact same visual, the exact same olfactory, like smell, and the exact same gustatory, like the same taste delusion, right? Because you have multiple occurrences where Jesus is having a meal. They're sitting. They can smell the food. They can taste it. They can hear the sound of chewing. They can smell the wood in the room. They can feel the utensils. They can watch Jesus physically pull bread apart and pull fish apart and eat it. So you have to then admit that they're all having the exact same delusion across all of these spectrums to the exact same extent, and they're all having them at the exact time through different moments and eras of time. That seems like a pretty far-fetched stretch. It seems like what is more plausible to believe is that they really were witnessing the resurrected Christ. That seems to be more plausible to me. After he talks here about this bereavement delusion, he then says something that's just academically incorrect. He said there's no academic field that accepts the resurrection of Christ. He says neurology, biology, psychology, none of these fields accept the resurrection of Christ. And I immediately, just thinking of this, I'm like, well, what about Dr. Gary Habermas? What about Dr. William Lane Craig? What about Dr. Michael Licona? These men have all defended the resurrection of Christ at the highest academic levels. They have publicly debated people, publicly written, peer-reviewed literature defending the historicity and the veracity of the resurrection of Christ. The jury is not out on the resurrection. In fact, we're seeing on a popular level a lot of people returning to believe in this. Dr. Jordan Peterson, one of the most famous public personas right now, has publicly said that he needs at least 3 years to study the resurrection of Christ because he's admitted something monumental is happening at that moment. Dr. Paula Fredrickson, who is a New Testament scholar, not a Christian. She is not a believer in Christ, even though she studies the New Testament. Go figure that one out. I don't know how you can study the New Testament and not be a Christian. Anyways, she states in an article she put in Christianity Today, she states, I do know as a historian, the disciples must have seen something. When she's speaking about the resurrection, she's saying, historically speaking, they saw something. There's no way to explain what happened unless they really saw something. Then this clip here ends with T-Jump saying there's no second-hand accounts of these 500 witnesses. Paul says there's 500 people in Jerusalem. You can go ask them. His critique is, well, show me some second-hand corroboration. Show me somebody who actually backed this up. You just said there's 500, but we have no documents. We have no testimony. We have nothing from these 500. These 500 are silent, right? And so his point is, how am I supposed to believe these 500 when we have no second-hand information from them? Well, we actually do have secondhand information from the Jewish historian Josephus, but a lot of atheists like to throw that out because they doubt the historicity of it. Josephus literally validates that Jesus was crucified on a cross and people believe he resurrected from the dead, but they oftentimes will throw that out. They don't think it's historically correct. Here's the problem with this argument. This argument, calling for secondhand corroboration, it cuts both ways. The Christian can just as easily use this argument to say, well, find me a first century historical document that proves the tomb is still occupied and not empty. Right? The burden of proof isn't solely on the Christian. The burden of proof is also upon the atheist here. We have the historical evidence that Christianity explodes in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century. The atheist absolutely has to explain, how did that happen? So find me then a 1st century document that says, no, we went to Joseph of Arimathea's tomb, the tomb is still occupied. You can't find that document. Show me a 1st century document that says we interviewed the 500 witnesses and it's all bogus, it's all a lie, this thing is a crock. You will not find that document as well. This secondhand corroboration argument cuts both ways. The Christian can use it just as successfully against the atheist. It doesn't really move the ball forward. Okay? Here's where the Christian does have the upper hand. As I said, our secondhand corroboration is really the explosion of Christianity. And here's what I mean. How do you account for Christianity exploding in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century if this was all a lie? If Paul is arguing, don't take my word for it, you can go ask other people. If Peter is arguing the same way, if the rest of the 11 disciples are arguing, don't take our word for it, you can ask other people. And this thing explodes despite persecution, despite hostility. How do you account for that? How do you explain the historical evidence that this thing goes viral despite persecution? Because every other religious system that's had a messianic figure who died, that religious system dies in about 30 years. You have some cult leader, people think this is the Messiah, this is the guy that's going to take us to heaven. That person dies. The movement usually dies about 20 to 30 years after that. Not in the case with Christianity. In fact, Christianity is picking up steam 30 years after Christ's death. How do you account for that? How do you account for the fact that Christianity has transcended every cultural, linguistic, and geographical boundary on planet Earth? No other religion has done that. If you look at every other religion of the world, they primarily stay located where the religion started. The centers of Christianity have moved around the world. Christianity started in the Middle East. It then became centered in Europe. It then became centered in North America. Now you see Christianity exploding in Latin America, China, Africa. How do you account for this? How do you account for a Jewish carpenter impacting such a wide swath of people? How do you account for the fact that Christianity thrives under persecution? How do you account that Christianity has not spread itself by sword and violence like Islam, but has rather spread itself by humility, by graciousness, by quiet, peaceful testimony about the power and the resurrection of Christ? If this was all a lie, if this was all a grift and not true, how on earth do you explain what has happened historically? You have to provide a better explanation to account for the data. Because for me, the only thing that makes logical sense is that this man, Jesus of Nazareth, really did come back from the dead. You can't explain it away by hallucinations. You can't explain it away by bereavement delusions. You can't say that there's no academic attestation for this. There are tons of scholars who are arguing for this on a very powerful level at the highest institutions. And when somebody tries to say, well, there's no secondhand corroboration of it, well, look at what historically happened. If Paul, if Peter, if the other disciples were lying, Christianity should have died on the table in the first century. It should have died 30 years after Jesus died, just like every other religious movement, but it didn't. It picked up steam. It gained momentum despite every human effort to crush it. What seems most plausible, what seems like the most logical explanation, is that Christ really did rise from the dead. So, man, that was a lot. Thank you for listening to all that. If you made it this far, give yourself a hand. This is some meat and potatoes. Listen, once again, I hope that this isn't just intellectual exercise. I hope that this isn't like, finally, I got some ammo to like punch back at the atheists. No. The scriptures tell us to be patient with those who have doubts, right? Be ready to defend what you believe, but do so with gentleness and respect. So God help me with that, help my friends with that. But I pray more that this just fortifies your heart. I pray this gives you real confidence, not pie in the sky, empty faith. I pray this gives you real, solid confidence that Christ resurrected from the dead. And if he resurrected from the dead, our hope is real. Heaven is real. His transformative power in our lives is real. It's important, man. It's really important. So thank you for checking this out. I hope it blessed you, and I will see you on the next podcast. God bless. Hey, real quick before you go, thank you again for checking out this episode of the Chad Blackman Podcast. If you could do me a solid and like this, share it, rate it, do whatever you can do on the platform you're listening to help this get to more people, I would greatly appreciate it. Thanks again for your support. God bless you.